sending my boyfriend somewhere across the sea. I know I'll cry my heart out when they take him from me. How could they be so mean to my little Marie? He's really all that I've got, and I love him an awful lot. The Marines are sending my boyfriend somewhere across the sea. I know I'll cry my heart out when they take him from me. Oh, my little Marie, though an ocean's between, you'll still be all that I've got, and I love you an awful lot.
The Kennedy assassination was the pivotal event of the Cold War. To understand the Kennedy assassination, it is essential that we understand the dynamics of this war and its main battlefield, Cuba.
Habana, como extraño el sol indiano de tus tardes. Habana, como sueño con mi Habana entre dos palmas. Habana,
Havana in the 1950s was like no other place in the world. Well known as a city of pleasure, it was actually a type of political and criminal free zone, a strange place where mobsters mixed freely with businessmen and politicians, most of them from America.
Pre-Castro Cuba was probably the closest Latin American country to the United States. They had television, they had air conditioners, they had all the amenities that we had, and it was America's playground.
All of Havana was treated as a huge resort for people who wanted to go play, gamble, prostitution, drinking, partying. Beaching was almost secondary to the control that the mafia exercised over Cuba and the domination of U.S. corporations in the Cuban economy, all combined to create a feeling in Cuba of resentment towards the United States of America.
In effect, you've got America owning practically all the economy of Cuba. And that's, and of course the mafia operated down there. That was the abortion capital. Everybody went down there for an abortion.
Habana, a pesar de la distancia no te olvido. Habana, como siento la nostalgia de volver.
At the center of this creative criminal energy was a former Army general named Fulgencio Batista, a mulatto Cuban who took control of the country in 1952 and ran it with help from the mafia and the United States government.
Batista was as corrupt a scoundrel as Latin American governments have ever produced. And the fact that he rose through the ranks of a national police force that had been created and trained by the United States, that he was widely seen as being in the palm of the mafiosos who ran Havana and answering directly to the dictates of Washington, certainly didn't help him in any way with any legitimacy with the Cuban people. But the truth was that everybody in Cuba, from the peasantry to the upper middle class for the most part, thought that Batista was rotten and was angry at him for corruption and for the repression that he brought to Cuba.
Many Cubans, frustrated by the dictatorial rule of Batista, started to take the law into their own hands. By 1958, it was having a decided effect on business.
But in Havana, a few tourists and business visitors are enjoying what may be the last few days of a nervous peace. Most of the tourists don't feel the nervousness. They soak up the sun of the Cuban spring around the pool of the Hotel Nacional. A sprinkling of them dot the 630 rooms of the newly opened Habana Hilton. They play roulette at the Capri or the Riviera. They shop along La Rampa or on the Prado. This lady and her family are here on pleasure. Now, you didn't let word of the fighting change your plans, right?
Oh, no, not at all. Didn't even think of changing them.
Have you regretted the decision to come ahead?
No, we've been having a marvelous time here. It's been beautiful. The weather's lovely.
Have you seen any signs of trouble?
None whatsoever. No place at all.
You think it's coming soon?
No, I don't see anything to be worried about.
Deep in the rural foothills of Cuba, a revolution was brewing, and it was led by a charismatic Cuban intellectual named Fidel Castro.
Aquí pensaban seguir ganando el 100% con casas de apartamentos y echar al pueblo a sufrir y seguir de modo cruel contra el pueblo conspirando para seguirlo explotando y en eso llegó Fidel.
Castro himself has become a figure of legend in the 16 months since he invaded Oriente Province from a small boat. The rebels' actual achievements were few for most of that time, but by mere existence and survival, Castro's force has both grown and exerted an influence out of all proportion to its size.
In the summer of 1958, Castro, his brother Raul, and their associate, Argentine Dr. Che Guevara, led a sabotage campaign that would lead, by the end of the year, to the defeat of Batista.
Señora Marta Fernández Miranda de Batista, primera dama de la República. También se celebró un lucido y fastuoso banquete homenaje. En el campamento militar de Colombia tuvo lugar un esplendoroso desfile. Marchan marcialmente los nuevos soldados de la patria. Sangre fresca, carácter joven que será forjado con altos principios de patriotismo, asegurado por la misión militar norteamericana que en gesto de hermandad y panamericanismo nos ofrece el gobierno de Estados Unidos. Saludan ante el gobernador señor presidente de la República Mayor de destacada figura de la vida nacional, distinguidas personalidades del cuerpo y de los fuerzas de nuestro país, así como la alta oficialidad de las Fuerzas Armadas.
Despite all this, the United States supported Batista almost till the very end, until it became clear that the longer they supported him, the harder it was going to be to install some middle-of-the-road government that would still be responsive to the United States. By the time they came to that realization, it was too late. Batista fell, his military collapsed, and the Castro forces walked into Havana largely unresisted and cheered by virtually the entire country.
Now it's exactly 10 minutes after 2 a.m. here in Cuba. You're going to be up at around 5 o'clock, but I'll ask you 2 more questions and then we'll both go to bed. Never mind. What I'd like to ask you is this, Fidel. In Latin American countries over and over again, dictators have come along. They've raped the country, they've stolen the money, millions and millions of dollars, tortured and killed people. How do you propose to end that here in Cuba?
Very easy. Not permitting that any dictatorship come again to rule our country. You can be surely that Batista will be the last dictator of Cuba.
The people of the United States, they have great admiration for you and your men, because you are in the real American tradition of a George Washington, of any man who started off with a small body, fought against a great nation and won. We want you to like us, and we like you.
Only 3 months after the revolution, Castro made a surprise visit to the United States. Although he was usually praised as a liberator and a hero, there was growing concern that his government was filled with communists.
Now meet the press. Our guest, ladies and gentlemen, is the Prime Minister of Cuba, Dr. Fidel Castro, now in this country for a visit.
Now, Dr. Castro, if you're ready, we'll start the questions with May Craig.
Senator Smathers of Florida says that you have many communists in your government. Is that so?
And because Senator Smathers said it ought to be true, I don't think that. I can, in first place, that is, I have read some lists that I don't doubt that if it continued to discovering such communists in our government, including Adam and Eve, are going to be communists too.
He met secretly here in Washington with Vice President Richard Nixon. And even Richard Nixon, of all people, was somewhat taken by the charisma of this young revolutionary. That was the first impression that Richard Nixon had of Fidel Castro. Now, he quickly went on to become one of the leading advocates of trying to overthrow Castro, denouncing him as a communist. But it is interesting from a historical point of view to note that the first impression was a relatively benign one.
Everyone is voting for Jack, 'cause he's got what all the rest like. Everyone wants him back. Jack! Jack is on the right track, 'cause he's got
While Fidel Castro was redefining the Cuban political structure, another charismatic figure was surging in the United States of America. Like Fidel, John F. Kennedy was battling an entrenched right-wing government that had held political power since 1952. Kennedy was also a proud family man who relied primarily on the counsel of his own brother. And Kennedy was the rare type of politician who could earn not only popular respect, but love and admiration. He was a celebrity. With so much in common, Fidel Castro and John F. Kennedy would seem to be destined for friendship and partnership, but that was not to be. Before Kennedy was elected, Castro became involved in a series of confrontations with the Eisenhower administration and with American business interests. Within his first year, Castro had taken over the U.S.-run telephone companies, had forced rate reductions from the electrical companies, had expropriated hundreds of thousands of acres from U.S. sugar and fruit companies, and had nationalized the oil refineries. Most dangerously, he had made a public pact with America's enemy, the Soviet Union, at once alienating the United States and thrusting his country smack in the middle of the Cold War.
There is a limit to what the United States in self-respect can endure. That limit has now been reached.
The Eisenhower administration responded by closing their embassy and breaking all ties to Castro's Cuba. But that wasn't all. As Kennedy would learn, the Eisenhower administration was determined to bring Castro down.
Soon after the elections, it became necessary to brief President-elect Kennedy on vital security matters. I was then director of the Central Intelligence Agency, and I remember meeting him in the Kennedy home in Palm Beach. He was visibly sobered by the information I brought him. No one who has not held the office can comprehend the burdens and the problems a president must face.
For a full year, the Eisenhower administration had been planning an invasion of Cuba, using disenfranchised anti-Castro Cubans as their fighting force. In transferring power to Kennedy, the Eisenhower administration also transferred this secret plan. It became known as the Bay of Pigs.
This is Ron Oppen in Miami. I'm standing in one of the many anti-Castro recruiting places scattered throughout the city. Since 2 o'clock this morning, men and boys have been filing through this door behind me, anxious to join the fight in Cuba against Fidel Castro's government. Once inside that small, overcrowded room, they're measured for uniforms, personal data is taken, including next of kin, and the men are told where to assemble for the jumping off to Cuba. No one here will talk about just when it will be, but one official told me he expects it to be sometime tonight.
Cuban revolutionary troops such as these have invaded Castro's leftist island fortress, reportedly rallied by a mysterious coded radio message. Alert, alert, look well at the rainbow. The fish will be running very soon. From the sea and by parachute, the rebels have struck along the coast within 90 miles of Havana. Initial accounts of the fighting sketchy, but strafing and bombing of communications and military targets reported with heavy casualties. Fidel's grip is threatened as word of some defections comes out. But the fiery bearded Castro is hardly short on words as he attacks what he calls United States imperialism and calls on sister Latin American republics to aid Cuba.
I've said as much as I feel can be usefully said by me in regard to the events of the past few days. Further statements, detailed discussions are not to conceal responsibility because I'm the responsible officer of the government, but merely because and that is quite obvious, but merely because I do not believe that such a discussion would benefit us during the present difficult situation.
The Bay of Pigs was a serious and embarrassing failure for the Kennedy administration and had the unforeseen effect of making Castro even stronger within his new country. Castro used this opportunity to make his ideological stand official. On May 1st, 1961, he declared Cuba to be a communist state. This declaration shifted the dynamic of the conflict. The United States was no longer supporting counter-revolutionary elements against Castro. It was now defending its boundaries against worldwide communist aggression.
The Bay of Pigs was a total CIA operation. The CIA thought they could stir an uprising in Cuba, total misjudgment of Castro's popular support. Allen Dulles, the head of the CIA, and Richard Bissell, the fellow who was in charge of the CIA, planning the CIA operation, came to him and laid out the plans. And Kennedy thought that it, as he put it, it was too noisy an operation. He wanted it to be done much more surreptitiously, and he wanted it to be done so that the United States could disavow any connection to it at all. What was done was that Dulles and Bissell eventually planned the landing at the Bay of Pigs so that it would fail if, in fact, Kennedy didn't permit not only air support, but major intervention, major ground forces, U.S. ground forces, to become a part of it. And they never believed Kennedy wouldn't do that. When Kennedy didn't go along at the height of the crisis, the operation failed. And as a result of that, Kennedy became totally disillusioned with the CIA. And he became even angrier at Castro, who kept rubbing his nose in it.
After the Bay of Pigs, he was so annoyed with the CIA that he said that he'd like to rip the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the wind.
Kennedy did not dismantle the CIA. He did, however, try to control it and make it his own. He fired the key Eisenhower appointees such as Director Allen Dulles, Deputy Director and Air Force General Charles P. Cable, and Deputy Director of Plans Richard Bissell. And he looked for his own man to run the agency.
Kennedy, after the Bay of Pigs, was very concerned about the CIA, which had been the author of this plan, which Eisenhower had approved. And Kennedy couldn't really get out of it, or felt he couldn't get out of it. he was searching for some person. He thought for a moment that he'd send Robert Kennedy to run the CIA. But Robert Kennedy declined that. He said he thought it would be a great mistake to send a Democrat and a brother to run the CIA. So they settled on John McCone. He felt it was an agency out of control.
But Kennedy never truly brought the agency under control, and his defeat at the Bay of Pigs made him susceptible to a new and intense criticism.
Developments in Red Cuba, 90 miles from the shores of Florida, hold more ominous warnings for a sleeping American public. While the deadly enemies of the American people close in for their final stages of encircling our nation, enemy nations within intensify efforts to chip away the foundations upon which American freedom rests. More and more strange voices call for surrendering of our national sovereignty to some type of world authority. There are increasing efforts to centralize authority in the federal government in Washington, D.C. under the guise of federal aid.
Of all the defeats in the Cold War, the capture of Cuba by the communists is the most unacceptable. Super patriots knew Castro was a communist in 1957. But moderate patriots, such as the State Department, haven't admitted it yet.
If we could get our government to stop helping the communists everywhere in the world while pretending to do the opposite, for just 6 months, the whole communist worldwide empire would start falling to pieces. That's all we would have to do.
The attacks of the radical right were hurting Kennedy, who was becoming more and more ineffective and defensive. With picketers heckling him outside a Los Angeles conference center, he started to lash out.
Now we are face to face once again with a period of heightened peril. The risks are great, the burdens heavy, the problems incapable of swift or lasting solution. And under the strains and frustrations imposed by constant tensions and harassment, the discordant voices of extremism are once again heard in the land. Men who are unwilling to face up to the danger from without are convinced that the real danger is from within. They look suspiciously at their neighbors and their leaders. They call for a man on horseback because they do not trust the people. They find treason in our churches, in our highest court, in our treatment of water. They equate the Democratic Party with the welfare state, the welfare state with socialism, socialism with communism. They object, quite rightly, to politics intruding on the military, but they are very anxious for the military to engage in their kind of politics.
Unsure of his powers and unable to run with his policies, Kennedy tried to silence these critics by fighting the Cold War on their terms. He authorized a CIA covert action against Cuba, and he put his brother in charge of the operation. It became known as Operation Mongoose.
Operation Mongoose was a sabotage project. It was a pinprick sabotage, as it worked out. It was a totally futile endeavor.
It was basically a political operation in favor of the Kennedys. I guess the Kennedys probably learned it at their father's knee in terms of don't get mad, get even. And I guess they were quite concerned about what they had done during the Bay of Pigs activity, the operation, and maybe felt some guilty conscience about the whole thing. Maybe they didn't, but whatever it was, they sure as heck had Castro in their sights and their target.
The Cuban operation was very much under the shadow of the Attorney General. He had many other things on his mind, but he would come regularly to the meetings of the Operation Mongoose people and urge them, exhort them to do more, and so on. He never knew precisely what he wanted them to do.
Lots of boom and bang is the phrase they used, which basically translated to sabotage operations. and they'd hoped to be able to get rid of Castro and the Castro regime just by snapping their fingers.
The operation was massive. I mean, they had truck depots, they had huge supplies of arms, they rented at least hundreds of cars, and set up camps, set up anti-Castro training camps in the Keys, in the Everglades, in the Bahamas at the time, and provided support for the training of the Cubans. And they were very successful. The operations were, in fact, doing a lot of harm. They were blowing up refineries. They were causing a lot of confusion and fear in Cuba.
46 were wounded, 2 killed under questionable circumstances. Castro, in a broadcast speech lasting most of the night, says bombs from U.S.-based planes are responsible for the casualties. Other reports say it was men in cars. Whatever his reasons, Castro stirs strong feelings of anger against the United States.
But the only decent thing that came out of the whole Mongoose operation, the boys in Miami, where we had our base, were able to recruit some little farmer or a peasant in Pinar del Rio province in the western part of Cuba. And he gave us a report, and all it said was, in an area bounded by 4 towns, is the only report that mentioned these 4 towns. And if you plot these 4 towns on a map and connect them up with a thin line, you'll see you get what became called a trapezoid area. And that's what targeted the U-2. That's what finally got the U-2 over that particular spot. And the rest, of course, is now history. The U-2 came back with the pictures, and we had the evidence we needed. Kennedy had the evidence he needed.
Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on the island of Cuba.
And then President John began to speak, and I knew right away he wouldn't be weak. Well, he said he'd seen some missile bases and terrible smiles on Cuban faces, close pictures, carrying land reform too far, giving land to the USSR. Well, he said we mustn't be afraid, we're setting up a little blockade. Put our ships along the Cuban shores, and if the Russian bear yells and roars, we'll let him have it. From Turkey and Greece, Formosa and Spain, the peaceful West European plain. From Alaska and Greenland, we'll use our means and 20,000 submarines. We're gonna teach the Russians a lesson for trying to upset the balance of power.
One mistake can make this whole thing blow up, so that one major mistake by either Mr. Khrushchev or by us here. So that's why it's much easier to make speeches about some of the things that we ought to be doing, but I think that anybody who watches, looks at the fatality list on atomic weapons and realizes that the communists have a completely twisted view of the United States and that we don't comprehend them, that's what makes life in the 60s hazardous.
Let's sink Cuba into the sea and give them back democracy under the water. Well, the deadline was set for 10 o'clock. For a Cold War, it was getting hot. Well, the Russians tried, the Russians failed. Homeward bound, those missiles sailed. Mr. Khrushchev said, better red than dead.
The Cuban Missile Crisis was what the anti-Castro Cubans had dreamt about. They loved it. I mean, to them, this was the opportunity to finally get rid of Castro. They didn't seem to quite appreciate the fact that in the process they may have blown up the world. But if Castro could be disposed of, what the hell?
The pressures to invade Cuba were persistent and intense. The anti-Castro Cubans wanted to reclaim their land. The radical right wanted to destroy communism. And individuals within the CIA saw this as an opportunity to avenge the Bay of Pigs fiasco. But the most influential voices for invasion were the members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, many of them proud of their right-wing viewpoints and each of them empowered to argue their case before Kennedy.
The logical argument is we don't really have to invade Cuba. That's just one of the difficult
life like we did with the Soviet Union and China.
It becomes of no value unless the weapons, and that of course includes your doggone airplanes that can bomb it, unless the weapons that can cause trouble there are eliminated, all you have is a hunk of dirt that's taken a hell of a lot of people to hang on to.
Well, let me ask you, if we go ahead with this airstrike, either on the missiles or the missiles and the planes, and the recommendations to do both, when could that be ready?
We can be ready for attack at dawn on the 21st, I think the earliest possible day. The optimum day would be Tuesday morning.
I appreciate your view. As I said, we all understand how rather unsatisfactory alternative. The argument for the blockade was that we want to do is avoid if we can a nuclear war, provide for escalation, for imbalance.
If somebody can keep them from doing the goddamn thing piecemeal, that's our problem. You go in and frig around with a missile, you're screwed. You go in and frig around a little else, you're screwed. That's right. You're screwed. And if some goddamn thing, some way, you can say either do the son of a bitch and do it right, and quit frigging around. That was my principle. Don't frig around and go take a missile. Well, I wasn't intentional. It's goddamn if you want to do it. You can't fiddle around with taking out missiles. You can't fiddle around with hitting the missile sites and then hitting the SAM sites. And you've got to go in and take out the goddamn thing that's going to stop you from doing your job.
Kennedy refused to invade Cuba and was able to resolve the crisis peacefully. In doing so, Kennedy stood up to Khrushchev, but he also stood up against the radical right and the Joint Chiefs of Staff.
I have today been informed by Chairman Khrushchev that all of the IL-28 bombers now in Cuba will be withdrawn in 30 days. He also agrees that these planes can be observed and counted as they leave. Inasmuch as this goes a long way towards reducing the danger which faced this hemisphere 4 weeks ago, I have this afternoon instructed the Secretary of Defense to lift our naval quarantine.
But there were moments at the end of the Cuban Missile Crisis when some members of the Joint Chiefs had been hoping for an order to invade Cuba. Were very furious that Kennedy had resolved this crisis peacefully. And they felt a great opportunity had been lost to invade Cuba, to test out new weapons, to get rid of Castro, and so on.
There are many ways to take a stand. Some public, some private. Some from reason, some from faith. If we are numb to the language of words, we must speak in the language of faces.
Really is for testing and dropping bombs. Who? The people? No, just isn't so.
The newspapers, some of them are. The politicians are, but not the people.
I don't think anyone in their right mind could hope for a nuclear war. I think both sides realize that it would be the destruction of their countries and probably of the rest of humanity.
Who do you represent?
I represent myself, my son, and my unborn child will be born in November, and to protest silently as a private citizen and as a woman and a concerned mother the resumption of atmospheric nuclear testing, which I think was unnecessary and will start off a chain reaction of testing by other nations, thus contaminating the atmosphere, affecting future generations and God knows what all.
John F. Kennedy emerged from the Cuban Missile Crisis a new man and a new power. Standing up to the radical right and the vestiges of the Eisenhower administration, he was finally able to set his own agenda and enact his own policies and ideas. He took full advantage of the opportunity by calling for a test ban treaty.
Both Kennedy and Khrushchev stared into the nuclear abyss, and both of them were determined thereafter to move toward détente. And the first action in that was, of course, the American University speech, which was followed by the negotiation of the test ban treaty.
At American University, he did the unthinkable. He extended a hand of peace to the Soviet Union.
No government or social system is so evil that its people must be considered as lacking in virtue. As Americans, we find communism profoundly repugnant as a negation of personal freedom and dignity. But we can still hail the Russian people for their many achievements in science and space, in economic and industrial growth, in culture, in acts of courage. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures, and we are all mortal.
Kennedy was at the height of his popularity, the true leader of the free world.
The Senate approved the test ban treaty on September 24th, 1963. That morning, the president began a trip to 11 western states. The theme of the trip was conservation, but it had a political purpose too. Our route was along the lines of where we were going to have political battlegrounds in 1964. States like Montana and Wyoming, Washington, Utah. The conservatives were strong out there. The men who would be our candidates were under attack from the Birch elements. The president was trying to strike a theme that would reach these people. About the time we hit Montana, though, he began to weave the theme of peace and the test ban treaty into his speeches. And here he struck a real chord. Crowds became very enthusiastic, and the president found out then that he had an issue that would move the people.
So we have lived, even in the short space of the last 3 years, on 2 occasions when we were threatened by a direct military confrontation. We wish to lessen that prospect. We know that the struggle between the communist system and ourselves will go on. We know it will go on in economics and productivity, in ideology, in Latin America and Africa and the Middle East and Asia. But what we hope to do is lessen the chance of a military collision between these 2 great nuclear powers, which together have the power to kill 300 million people in the short space of a day. That's what we're seeking to avoid. That's why I support the test ban treaty.
The radical right was quick to attack Kennedy's newfound popularity, but they no longer received the audience they once did, and many of the mainstream conservatives were becoming defensive.
There's been radicalism on both sides of the center line ever since we've had a government in this country. But I'm not as concerned about what we call the radical right in this country as I am about the radical left who are working in our government. I'm more concerned about Arthur Schlesinger, who about 12 years ago advocated socialism for America, than I am some man out in a small town someplace in this country saying he's against communism.
I know Senator Goldwater, and he is not one of the kooks, as I call them, of the radical right. He is a responsible conservative, and I think that we need responsible conservatism in the country.
What about the Kennedy administration? How do you feel about them? Are they doing enough or not enough?
I don't understand President Kennedy and Attorney General Bob Kennedy and their liberal associates. Many of us, especially ministers of the gospel who are Orthodox Protestants, are proud of President Kennedy's religious orthodoxy. He believes something, and we thank God that he believes in God, and that he believes in Christ, and he believes in the Holy Spirit. We're proud that he believes something religiously, but we're concerned about his associates, his liberal associates.
I don't know if I could say his personal popularity is waning, but the popularity of his program has certainly hit the skids. It's going downhill about as fast as any program I've ever seen.
That would mean that the Democratic Party's popularity has gone down, you feel?
Yes. Yeah, that would be part of the answer. Now, it will probably reflect on him in the course of the next 3 or 4 months, but his personal popularity, I find, is still rather high.
The politics of fear were losing out to the politics of hope, and a new generation was becoming energized by the conflict. Disobeying a ban on travel to Cuba, a group of American students arranged to visit Havana and were arrested upon their return to the United States. They became the subjects of an emotional and controversial hearing held by the House Un-American Activities Committee.
How do you feel about the restrictions on travel to Cuba?
Well, I certainly feel that here in this country we should have no restrictions at all on travel.
Did you go to Cuba?
That's correct.
And what did you think of what you saw there?
Well, it's very hard to sum up what I saw in Cuba, but regarding the travel ban, I'm definitely against travel bans. Regarding Cuba, I could go into that at great length at another time.
Are you glad you went?
Very glad. Very glad indeed.
Well, it's of a bold reporter, a story I will tell. He went down to the Cuban land, the nearest place to hell. He'd been there many times before, but now the law does say the only way to Cuba is with the CIA.
Fidel Castro showed up at the Hotel International. I thought he was there to make a speech or to address the American students. And he arrived with his 3 cars with his bodyguards. And he came into the hotel and asked if he could play ping pong with anybody. And he went to the back of the hotel and he proceeded to play ping pong with one of the students. I expected that this would be a sign of humility. He plays ping pong with the students. However, after about the 3rd or 4th game, I began to think this guy wants to play ping pong. He was keeping score, and he was playing for 21, which takes a long time. And he played ping pong for almost 3 hours. And at the end of this, a lot of students wanted to ask him questions about Cuba, and he said that he had to get back to the affairs of state after spending almost 3 hours playing ping pong.
William Worthy isn't worthy to enter our door. Went down to Cuba, he's not American anymore. But somehow it is strange to hear the State Department say, you are living in the free world you must stay.
After the Cuban Missile Crisis was resolved, and it was clear that there would be no invasion of Cuba, a rumor started to circulate among anti-Castro Cubans that Kennedy had made a secret deal with Khrushchev. According to the rumor, Khrushchev removed the missiles in exchange for Kennedy's agreement to end his hostilities with Cuba.
The anti-Castro Cubans here couldn't believe it. I mean, to them this was the utmost in traitorous behavior. Some anti-Castro Cubans even thought he was communist, thought he was a mole at the highest level, as it were. I mean, this is the kind of thinking that was going on at the time. And a tremendous hatred of Kennedy developed among the anti-Castro Cubans, and also among the CIA agents who, in fact, had become so associated with the anti-Castro Cubans and training them, and even going on raids with them, actually. Their sense of betrayal was as strong as that which the anti-Castro Cubans felt.
The anti-Castro Cubans were not getting the sympathy or support they once did, and they took out their frustrations at peace demonstrations, which, ironically, often turned violent. One of the most prominent peace groups was a pro-Cuba organization called Fair Play for Cuba. The New Orleans chapter of Fair Play for Cuba was manned by an ex-Marine named Lee Harvey Oswald. He was the only member of the chapter, and he was filmed passing out pro-Cuba literature on the streets. This activity led to a conflict with anti-Castro Cubans and to a series of television interviews in New Orleans.
You're a Marxist?
Well, I have studied Marxist philosophy, yes, sir, and also other philosophers.
But are you a Marxist? I think you did admit on an earlier radio interview that you consider yourself a Marxist.
Oh, I would very definitely say that I am a Marxist. That is correct. But that does not mean, however, that I'm a communist.
What is the difference between the two?
Well, there's a great deal of difference. Several American parties in several countries are based on Marxism, such as Ghana. Certain countries have characteristics of a socialist system, such as Great Britain with its socialized medicine. These, then, are the differences between an outright communist country and countries which adhere to leftist or Marxist principles.
In your work with the Fair Play for Cuba Committee, what are you advocating?
We advocate restoration of diplomatic, trade, and tourist relations with Cuba.
In the fall of 1963, while Kennedy was bathing in the adoration of the American public, he was also engaged in a series of vicious confrontations. On September 7th of 1963, Fidel Castro was reported to have threatened Kennedy's life, saying, quote, "United States leaders should think that if they are aiding terrorist plans to eliminate Cuban leaders, they themselves will not be safe," end quote. On October 3rd of 1963, the New York Times reported that the CIA was, quote, "a malignancy that the White House could not control." It went on to warn that if the United States ever experiences an attempt at a coup to overthrow the government, it will come from the CIA. The agency represents a tremendous power with total unaccountability to anyone, end quote. The Secret Service was becoming very concerned about threats to the life of President Kennedy, especially those involving anti-Castro Cubans and right-wing extremists. In October of 1963, Kennedy canceled a trip to Chicago at the last minute when it was learned that a group of 4 anti-Castro Cubans had been found with high-powered rifles. On November 18th of 1963, Kennedy canceled a motorcade in Miami after the Secret Service recorded a death threat posed by a wealthy right-wing extremist named Joseph Miltier. On November 22nd of 1963, John F. Kennedy went to Dallas.
Dallas is the city where 3 years ago Vice President and Mrs. Johnson were spat upon
and curse by a seething crowd in the lobby of one of our hotels. Dallas is the city where many leaders and officials expressed anxiety and fear of incident when first learning of the President and Mrs. Kennedy's intention to be our guests. Dallas is the city where on the day of the President and First Lady's arrival, the Dallas Morning News ran a full-page ad with the mocking caption, "Welcome, Mr. President." The ad contained a number of questions which were themselves accusations of President Kennedy, implying his cooperation with the U.S. Communist Party, his bloodily extermination of anti-communist allies, and his scrapping of the Monroe Doctrine in favor of the spirit of Moscow. In the name of God, what kind of city have we become?
The eyes of Texas are upon you all the livelong day.
It's not the individual person of Dallas. It's something evil, festering, stinking in this community.
The eyes of Texas are upon you. You cannot get away.
You who've written stories about the shame of Dallas and the rape of Americanism here know what I'm talking about. There's something that smells. And I want to get back to my own city because I'm going to vomit.
The city of Dallas has always had a strong effect on people. Long before Kennedy had been elected president, Dallas was recognized as a center for right-wing agitation and was home to a number of extremist groups.
And now, speaking for Christ and against communism, here is Billy James Hargis.
I lived as a boy in East Texas. We had an animal, a vulture, that we called the buzzard. And in the summertime, when we had drought and there was no rain, and the cattle or the livestock were dying in want of water, these buzzards would wait around, waiting until the situation killed the cattle, and then they'd soar down and devour the carcass. This is the way I see communism. They're not going to try to overthrow this government until we're bankrupt, until we have recession and depression, until our money's gone with our welfare state programs, our socialistic legislation, all these federal aid programs, and all this foreign aid commitments, and our commitments to the United Nations, and these international commitments, all of which are not stopping communism, but are certainly bankrupting the United States.
Yes, the citizens of Dallas were always perceived as a little angrier, a little meaner, and a little louder than the rest of us. And they seemed to like that reputation.
It is my pleasure and privilege, General Walker, to present to you at this time this certificate endowing you with all of the emoluments and the privileges of honorary citizenship in this great city of Dallas. Some years now, and in order to make him feel completely at home and to re-indoctrinate him into the habits of living here in Texas, a strictly hill country hat to General Walker.
In the months preceding the Kennedy assassination, a number of events caused great alarm in the city. On April 13th, a number of gunshots were fired at General Walker's home in Dallas. On October 24th, Adlai Stevenson was hit by placards wielded by Walker's more aggressive followers.
Shall we get on with the business of the meeting? Surely, my dear friend, I don't have to come here from Illinois to teach Texas manners, do I?
And on November 19th, 2 days before the arrival of President Kennedy, Alabama Governor George Wallace used Dallas to announce his candidacy to head the Democratic ticket for president.
I was in San Antonio and Amarillo. In fact, I have many friends from this great state. And in the struggle in which we are engaged now, involving the matter of constitutional government, I feel that there will be no stronger ally than that of the great state of Texas come next year, November 1964.
The atmosphere in Dallas on the eve of Kennedy's visit was tense, taut, and violent. Police Chief Jess Curry was concerned enough to confront the atmosphere in a statewide television address.
Because of the unfortunate incident which occurred here during the visit of Ambassador Stevenson, people everywhere in the world will be hypercritical of our behavior. Nothing must occur that is disrespectful or degrading to the President of the United States. He is entitled to the highest respect of all of our citizens. And the law enforcement agencies in this area are going to do everything within their power to ensure that no untoward accident or incident occurs. We will take immediate action if any suspicious conduct is observed. And we also urge all good citizens to be alert for such conduct.
It's wonderful to see you all here this morning. And we now are going to have the pleasure of hearing from Fort Worth's finest, the Texas Boys Choir.
On November 22nd, Kennedy arrived in the city of Fort Worth with Texas Governor John Conway.
Couldn't let you leave Fort Worth without providing you with some protection against the rain.
Put it on in the White House on Monday. If you'll come up there, you'll have a chance to see it there.
Well, it started off beautifully, as a matter of fact. Started off from the standpoint of spirit, at least, and enthusiasm. We got up in Fort Worth. He was jubilant about the reception he'd had. You see, at Fort Worth, this was the third stop we'd made. Everywhere we'd had tremendously enthusiastic, warm crowds that couldn't help but please him. So we were looking forward, actually, to coming to Dallas. And we were all eagerly awaiting the arrival in Dallas. Of course, we didn't talk about it much, as you well know, because it's not a very long flight in the 707 Fort Worth to Dallas. And Dallas had a wonderful reception at the airport. Everyone was extremely pleased. A tremendous crowd at the airport. He shook hands with a lot of them before we started the cavalcade downtown. So I would say that everyone was in extremely good spirits, high spirits, and particularly I think Ms. Kennedy had very much warmed to this type of an affair. As we came down, as we came through the residential area of Dallas, the crowds thinned a little bit. We talked. Again, he was extremely pleased, as was Ms. Kennedy, with the reception that they'd had. As we neared downtown Dallas, the crowds became enormous and extremely enthusiastic. As we came down through the main business district of Dallas, I would say we received as warm, as enthusiastic, as spontaneous a reception as we did in any city in the state. And it was really wonderful, to the point where just as we turned down by the courthouse, Nellie turned around and said to the president, she was so impressed by the warmth of the reception, she turned around and said to the president, well, Mr. President, you can't say that Dallas doesn't love you too. And he said, no, I think that's apparent, and or words to that effect. The crowds began to thin, but we were only about 5 minutes from the Trade Mart where the luncheon was to be held, so we all more or less straightened up in the car. I did, I know, and maybe I should explain that a little bit by saying that when you sit for a prolonged period of time, as we were, facing in one direction, acknowledging the crowd, why, when you get an opportunity, when the crowd thins, you kind of shift in the chair and straighten up, and we had just done that. I had, and I heard this shot, and I say shot because I immediately thought it was a shot. I immediately thought it was a rifle shot. Fear just swept through me, and I turned, thinking that the shot had come from back over my right shoulder. So I turned, and I obviously saw nothing but a tremendous crowd of people from where we had just come, and I saw nothing unusual, nothing out of the way, except people also had startled looks on their faces. They were turning, they were looking, and I didn't catch him in the corner of my eye. So I was in the process of turning to my left, and that's when I felt the impact of the bullet that hit me. Went in my back shoulder and came out my chest right here. I felt as if someone had just hit me in the back, a sharp blow with a doubled up fist. It more or less knocked me over, at least enough to where I looked down, and of course I was covered with blood, and frankly thought that I had been fatally hit. I never lost consciousness, and I was lying there and heard the third shot. I heard the third shot very distinctly. I heard it hit. I assumed that it hit the president, and it obviously did. The evidence was splattered all over the car and all over my clothes and all over Nellie, and it was a time of just unbelievable, stark tragedy. So many things go through your mind at that moment that I think it's probably impossible to relate at any future time, all the things that you thought. I know I thought, again, I rather assumed, without knowing, that the president had been fatally wounded. And I rather assumed that I had been. And so constantly there was going through my mind thoughts of Nellie, of the children, of what you'd done, and it's really difficult, I think, to try to explain all the things that you wonder about, all the things that you concern yourself with at a time like that.
I was just mad to see President Kennedy when he rode down this town. I saw that mean old snapper when he carried the president down. There'll be a man just like President Kennedy was. He's a man amongst men. Travel four corners was.
The president died 25 minutes after the shooting at 1 o'clock Eastern Standard Time.
Too sad, think, boy. Best president we ever had.
The eyes of the nation and the hearts of the nation are with Mrs. Kennedy today, and the eyes of Dallas, Texas are held in shame.
I just saw President Kennedy and the governor of Texas. Was shaking hands. He said, if I don't get my plan to governor, President Johnson will be the next man. He'll be a man. Just like President Kennedy was.
What are your first reactions to a tragedy of this sort?
My first reaction, sir, is that I hope these Southerners, these radicals, have satisfied they got their pound of flesh.
He's a man among men. Travel four corners of the world. I went home and I turned on my television. Looking Washington town, I saw 6 white horses carrying President Kennedy. To the very ground, won't be a man. Just like President Kennedy was.
We do not know if any of the people arrested so far are actually the person who pulled the trigger.
He was a man amongst men in the travel four corners of the world. What it said, I got to use. President Kennedy was dead. Church here don't come from you, flying airplane jets over my head. Never be a man, just like President Kennedy was.
You shoot the president? I didn't shoot anybody, no.
I heard that on church bell ring.
Your name is Lee Harvey Oswald, O-S-W-A-L-D.
Did you kill the president?
No, I've not been charged with that. In fact, nobody has said that to me yet.
You have been.
Nobody said what?
Sir?
You have been.
Nobody said what? Okay, we ain't hear you. Okay.
What did you do in Rochester?
Now you know the rooster told her your heads ought to go lay. Said, no, President Kennedy dead. I ain't got nowhere to stay. There'll be a man like President Kennedy was.
Oswald expired at 1:07 p.m. He died.
He was a man amongst men. Travel four corners of the world.
We have not been able to find anyone who saw and recognized Ruby at the time of this transfer.
My heart struck solid. Tears come falling down. When the kid, President Kennedy, let him down, they buried the ground. You never want to be a man like President Kennedy was. He was a man among men. Four corners, travel of the world. Sad what to say about President Kennedy. Never be another.
Fellow Democrats, with great pride, with great joy, I offer you for the presidency of the United States that son of the Texas hills, that tested and effective servant of the people, a real working leader in a time crying for full-time American leadership, Lyndon B. Johnson of Texas.
Lyndon Baines Johnson was a difficult Democrat, often at odds with his party. He was boisterous, cantankerous, and unpredictable. In 1956, he went so far as to endorse Eisenhower for president. But on November 22, 1963, he was indisputably at the head of his party and his country, the accidental president of the United States.
For a report on the man who is our new president, here is Eric Severin.
Walter, on this day of misfortune, perhaps some measure of comfort can be taken from one circumstance. This time, the successor to an assassinated president is a man of first-rank ability. He is 55 years old. He's in the prime of life for the responsibilities of the presidency, at a point where a man's experience and his energies meet at a high mutual level. Johnson was born in Texas near the hamlet called Johnson City, where the family flag flies over the LBJ Ranch. He's a lawyer by education, a politician by instinct, and by great success. His fierce fight against Mr. Kennedy for the Democratic nomination in 1960 seems only yesterday. Mr. Kennedy chose Johnson to be his running mate, partly because he had to have strength in the southern states. Johnson was the one man who could conciliate the southern conservatives, and this he did. In fact, there were many later on who said that Mr. Kennedy owed his election to Mr. Johnson. When the President Kennedy, died today, both he and the Vice President were engaged behind the scenes in trying to settle the feud within the Texas Democratic Party. And now all that, which does seem so petty in retrospect, all that doesn't matter very much. Mr. Johnson is the President. Texas is his personal political base in its totality.
As President, Johnson had much on his immediate agenda, including the investigation into the death of John F. Kennedy, but also the security of the country and his very credibility.
Problems look different when you're president. You may remember that President Kennedy said after he took office at his first news conference that although he'd campaigned on facing up to the grim realities of the world today, he was astonished when he actually sat in the president's chair and faced those grim realities himself. Now, Defense Secretary McNamara and McGeorge Bundy are briefing him in such terms as mega deaths. White House and Pentagon shorthand for the millions of deaths which are now in the hands of President Lyndon Johnson in case there should be a thermonuclear exchange. The words death of Earth are being exchanged once again in a briefing of the president. That dose in a thermonuclear exchange which might lethally contaminate the atmosphere and kill all persons on Earth. Now the responsibility of a new man, President Lyndon Johnson.
The problems were many and threatening. The Soviets were on nuclear alert, wondering if they would be blamed for the Kennedy assassination. The state and federal agencies were fighting over investigative tactics and turf. And the public speculation regarding the killing of the president was out of control.
I don't know what goes through some people's minds. I really don't. We don't need any enemies from abroad. We have them right here. And I don't think he should have gone down there, because we had a sample of Stevenson when they spit on him and everything. And our president took too many unnecessary chances.
We are told that the gunshot wound, the fatal wound inflicted on the President of the United States, entered at the base of the throat and came out at the base of the neck on the back side.
Personally, I think that some of those very ruthless oil millionaires down in Texas probably paid this man to, or these men, to pull this job. I don't think it was done by the person who actually wanted it done. I think it was a paid job.
There was almost an immediate concern among people that I know that this murder had been brought about by the right wing. And I know that in some communities where they had John Birch societies, men went out with axes and chopped down the John Birch Society advertisements immediately.
In a time of crisis, when the legitimacy of the presidency itself was at stake, Johnson turned to a friend and a neighbor, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover.
Lyndon Johnson called the head of the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover. Now you've got to understand, they lived across the street from each other for 30 years. They were close personal friends. I do not know what they said in that crucial telephone call. I don't know. But I know both men. I knew both men. I knew them well. And I think I'm entitled to speculate. You know what I think he said? I think Lyndon Johnson said to J. Edgar Hoover, and knowing Lyndon Johnson, he would have said it just about this way: Edgar, I want you to save your country.
Within an hour of the arrest of Lee Harvey Oswald, he had confirmed that it was a lone assassin for purely personal reasons that shot him. And that was Hoover's instantaneous vision. He got that sitting at his desk on the banks of the Potomac. And instantaneous. And many FBI agents, even at the local level, they wanted to go with this lone assassin theory, they called the lone nut theory. They immediately would move that way.
He had Oswald as a red. He had Oswald working in the building where the shots came from. If there wasn't Lee Harvey Oswald, would have to invent it because he has the proper credentials. So that in virtually every aspect of the first material coming in to put a context or put a picture on what has happened in Dallas, Hoover is wrong. But on one thing he is certain, before the day is over, virtually certain, and that is that Lee Harvey Oswald is the man.
The lone assassin theory was not an easy theory to sell. After all, Lee Harvey Oswald was a political animal. He had defected to Russia in 1959 and had a Russian wife. He had worked publicly for fair play for Cuba, and his activities had been monitored for years by both the CIA and the FBI. If Hoover was going to argue that Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone, he would have to provide a motive that made sense, one that would be powerful enough to result in the death of a president. Hoover argued that the motivation was not ideological, but instead psychological.
It's sad when a mother has to speak the words that condemn her own son, but I couldn't allow them to believe that I would commit murder. They'll put him away now, as I should have, years ago. He was always bad, and in the end he intended to tell them I killed those girls and that man, as if I could do anything except just sit and stare, like one of his stuffed birds. Well, they know I can't even move a finger, and I won't. I'll just sit here and be quiet, just in case they do suspect me.
Playing into the great psychological themes of the 1960s, J. Edgar Hoover was able to find a monster even greater than Oswald. He found Oswald's mother.
He was a happy-go-lucky youngster, actually. He had a dog, he had a bicycle, he belonged to the Y. He used to go to the Y and go swimming. I know many a time while at work he'd come in to see me from the Y, wringing wet, and it would be in the winter time. And I'd tell him he was going to catch cold because his hair was still wet, like all boys. He wouldn't dry himself thoroughly. We know, and it's sad and unfortunate, that Lee was deprived of his father, and he was born 2 months after his father had expired. But we must understand that Lee had 2 brothers, so he was not raised just with a woman alone.
J. Edgar Hoover made his case clear. In his official report on the assassination, issued within weeks after the killing of Kennedy, he came right out and concluded that Oswald, quote, was said to be suffering the impact of existing emotional isolation and deprivation, lack of affection, absence of family life, and rejection by a self-involved and conflicted mother, end quote. So that was that. No international conspiracy, no right-wing menace. A simple, crazed, lone gunman. A psycho with a rifle and a mother. Case closed. Lyndon Johnson was so pleased with this solution that he personally telephoned J. Edgar Hoover and congratulated him, saying, quote, I have more confidence in your judgment than anybody in town, end quote. The country could move on, but it didn't.
We think we're right in what we're doing right here. We believe in what we're doing. We want this man released. We want him released right now.
And just what happened?
Justified in what he did.
And what happened?
John Ruby killed the man that killed our president.
What's all the excitement going around right now?
These people right here, I don't know what they are or what they think they represent. But we're right in what we're doing. We're going to keep on doing it. Who are they to say? Are they Cubans? They come from Cuba. It doesn't make any difference. I'm not saying anybody's at fault.
How do you feel about this?
Well, I think he should be released because he killed our president, and I think the president was the best man in the whole world. And
correct yourself. He killed the man that killed our president. She's a little upset from here.
He killed the man that killed our president, and I don't think that man had any right to shoot him.
The public was not ready to close the case on the Kennedy assassination. Against his wishes, Johnson had to involve the Attorney General and begin discussions about a presidential commission. Robert Kennedy would not take part in the investigation, but instead his duties were assigned to Nicholas Katzenbach, the second Assistant Attorney General.
We know that in the probably a little after noon on the 24th of November, that's a Sunday, Nicholas Katzenbach at home in his study with no secretary available wrote out in longhand his famous memorandum for Mr. Moyer. And he said that we have to show the American people that the evidence is such that Lee Harvey Oswald killed the president. And he more or less said that we have to make Oswald the assassin. We have to quiet the discontent within the country. At the time that is happening, LBJ is then talking to Hoover saying that he does not want a presidential commission, when in fact he had just gotten off the phone with Katzenbach telling him he wanted one. It's very Byzantine. It's hard to believe that people operate this way on such an important issue, but in fact they did.
The Warren Commission was established by Lyndon Johnson largely and basically to reaffirm what the FBI report would be on this assassination. That was the purpose of the Warren Commission. That's not speculation. You can see that in the phone conversations with Lyndon Johnson and those prospective men who would serve on the commission. He wanted them to corroborate the FBI's report on this.
Dick?
Yes?
I hate to bother you again, but I wanted you to know that I made that announcement.
Well, announcement what?
Of this special commission.
Oh, you have already?
Yes. And I got Chief to hear. May I read it to you?
Yes.
The President announced that he is appointing a special commission to study and report upon all the facts and circumstances relating to the assassination of the late President John F. Kennedy and the subsequent violent death of the man charged with the assassination. The President stated that the majority and minority leadership of the Senate and the House had been consulted with respect to the proposed special commission. The members of the special commission are, Chief Justice Earl Warren, Chairman; Senator Richard Russell, Georgia; Senator John Cooper, Kentucky; Representative Hale Boggs, Louisiana; Representative Gerald Ford, Michigan; Honorable Allen Dulles, Washington; Honorable John J. McCloy, New York.
Well, now, Mr. President, I know I don't have to tell you my devotion to you, but I just can't serve on that commission. I'm highly honored you think about me in connection with it, but I couldn't serve there with Chief Justice Warren. I don't like that man, and I don't have any confidence in him.
Dick, it's already been announced, and you can serve with anybody for the good of America, and this is a question that has a good many more ramifications than on the surface, and we got to take this out of the arena where they're testifying that Khrushchev and Castro did this and did that, and kicking us into a war that can kill 40 million Americans in an hour. And you'd put on your uniform in a minute. Now, the reason I ask Warren is because he's the Chief Justice of this country, and we've got to have the best judicial people we can have.
I don't think the Chief Justice should have served on it.
You never turned your country down?
I could.
Well, this is not me. This is your country.
I just haven't. I can't do it. I haven't got the time.
Oh, well, all right. We'll just make the time. There's not going to be any time to begin with. All you're going to do is evaluate a Hoover report he's already made. Secretary of State came over here this afternoon. He's deeply concerned, Dick, about the idea that they're spreading throughout the communist world that Khrushchev killed Kennedy. Now, he didn't. He didn't have a damn thing to do with it.
Well, I don't think he did directly.
Well,
I know Khrushchev didn't, because he thought he'd get along better with Kennedy.
All right. But we got to have some people.
I wouldn't be surprised if Castro had.
All right, then okay. That's what we want to know. And people got confidence in you. They want to know what you think. What do you think I've done wrong now by appointing you on a commission?
Well, I just don't like Warren.
Well, of course you don't like Warren, but you like him before it's over with.
To LBJ, who was a political master, and his advisors, Earl Warren was a quintessential person for the Warren Commission for a number of reasons. One, the Supreme Court. Two, Republican. Three, the great esteem he was held in by the liberals. It was a must. It had to be done.
Lyndon Johnson appointed the Warren Commission, which was made up of very dignified and honorable men. Liberals and conservatives, Democrats and Republicans. And people think they conducted an investigation of the Kennedy assassination. They did not. The FBI conducted the investigation.
J. Edgar Hoover was concerned by the idea of a presidential commission. He had hung his reputation and the reputation of the FBI on the idea of a single gunman theory, and he couldn't abide by the humiliation of a differing conclusion. To ensure that everyone knew where he stood, he leaked the entire FBI report to the press before the commission was established.
Before the Warren Commission even gets its offices and its desks set up and its coffee machines plugged in. The conclusion of the FBI report, Commission Document 1, is already being leaked to the selected press across this country. That Lee Harvey Oswald did it, and he did it all alone. Before the Warren Commission begins its investigation, it knows what the conclusion it's supposed to find. It's boxed in. Now, why did the Warren Commission men, best and brightest, these respectable men, and these are respectable men, why did they allow this to happen? You can only imagine that they recognized that there was a need for a politically acceptable solution and that they would go along with it. You can imagine if the Warren Commission came up with a conclusion that was diametrically opposed to the FBI's report, the chaos. Second of all, one has to recognize the power of FBI Director Hoover. If you cross this man, what will your political future be?
All politicians in the United States live in fear of J. Edgar Hoover. They operated that way. And they operated that way for a good reason. He had the abilities to blackmail, and he exercised a terrific control, some of it almost Byzantine in the way it operated. And people that looked upon J. Edgar Hoover as sort of a latter-day American Christ, when in fact he was an ugly blackmailer, a man with no morals, and a person that represented all that was wrong in the United States of America.
Now, the Commission was concerned about this, the fact that they were boxed in, the fact that the conclusion that the conclusion they were supposed to arrive at, that Oswald did it all by himself, a lone nut, that already was being leaked in the public. They talked about this endlessly. Who was leaking? Who was leaking? Well, we know who was leaking. It was the FBI, to box the Commission in.
The Commission did its best in closed executive sessions to confirm the findings of the FBI report. But information would often surface that would not fit.
Let's see, the time of day was about, well, we're not very far from 2 hours from it. Yeah. The sun a bit, well, not so far.
Oh, well, it is
November
later
is
than
different,
this.
different
It is later than this, you see, much later. Hey, you see those two fellows?
Yeah.
Now tell them that we'd like to have them get to the west window on the south side overlooking the duct. We want to reconstruct the... yeah, that's what I mean.
The west window on the south side
of the 6th floor.
The most puzzling evidence concerned the amount of shots fired from the Texas School Book Depository. It appeared from the evidence that President Kennedy and Governor Conley were hit by different bullets coming from different directions. If so, more than one assassin was at Dealey Plaza on November 22nd, and Lee Harvey Oswald could not have acted alone. The Warren Commission concluded that both men were wounded by the same bullet in what has become known as the single bullet theory.
How much truth is there in this, that it's necessary to postulate one bullet injuring both men if there is not to be two assassins?
The one bullet conclusion. You call it the theory, I call it the conclusion. It was a theory until we found the facts. That's why I refer to it as the single bullet conclusion. All right. It is the view of the Commission as expressed in the report that it probably did occur that there was a single bullet conclusion.
So the single bullet is crucial. And it was Arlen Specter who first came to the conclusion that the same bullet hit Kennedy and Connolly. And this is the bullet Specter and the Commission say wounded two men. The Warren Commission said that one bullet hit Kennedy at the back of his neck. It passed through his throat and nicked his tie as it came out. It then went on into Governor Connolly's back. Now smashed through Connolly, smashed a rib, and came out below his breast, just below the nipple. And it wasn't finished yet. The bullet then hit his right wrist, tore through part of it, and then lodged in his left thigh. And this is the bullet that was supposed to have done all this. We found in America that one of the things that presented the greatest stumbling block to believing the Commission for the greatest number of people was the condition of bullet 399. Could a bullet which had done as much have come out looking like bullet 399?
There was also confusion about an 8mm film that was shot by an amateur cameraman named Abraham Zapruder. This film captured the assassination at the moment of impact and appears to show the president's head being thrust back, as if a bullet had hit him from the front. Since Oswald was situated behind the president, it would again indicate that another assassin was involved. It is interesting to note that CBS reporter Dan Rather, after screening the film, gave a misleading account over the radio, as if the head had been thrust forward.
Just returned from seeing a movie which clearly shows the president's assassination. It got about 35 yards from the base of the building. President Kennedy had just put his right hand up to the side of his right eye. The president lurched forward just a bit. It was obvious that he had been hit in the movies, but you had to be looking very closely in order to see it. The second shot, the third shot total, hit President Kennedy, and there was no doubt there. His head went forward with considerable violence. No doubt there.
The Warren Commission responded by suppressing the distribution of the film. However, they did print frames of the film in the Warren Commission report. Curiously, the order of the frames immediately following the impact of the headshot had been switched in the printing. The tenor of the Warren Commission is most dramatically revealed in the transcripts of an emergency session called by the Commission's attorney, Lee Rankin. Rankin had received evidence that Oswald once worked as an agent for the FBI. It concerned him for a number of reasons. Most obviously, because it tied Oswald into Hoover's agency. The transcript reads, Rankin, if that was true and it ever came out and could be established, you would have people think that there was a conspiracy to accomplish this assassination that nothing the Commission did or anybody could dissipate. Boggs, you are so right. Dulles, oh terrible. Boggs, the implications of this are fantastic, don't you think so? Rankin, now it is something that will be very difficult to prove out. I am confident that the FBI will never admit it, and I presume their records will never show it. Dulles, why would it be in their interest to say he is clearly the only guilty one? Rankin, they would like to have us fold up and quit. Boggs, this closes the case, you see. Rankin, they found their man. There is nothing more to do. The Commission supports their conclusion, and we can go on home, and that is the end of it. Boggs, I don't even like to see this being taken down. Dulles, yes, I think this record should be destroyed. On September 27, 1964, the Warren Commission report was released to great fanfare.
Two further impressions are inescapable from even a casual reading of the Commission report. First, Oswald was a liar. During the few hours between his arrest and his death, he was repeatedly interrogated. The Commission report reveals that he lied on important matters of substance. He lied about his rifle, his revolver, his movements, the documents found on his person. Second, no investigation could have been more painstaking than that carried out by this commission. Every resource of criminology was called into play: ballistics tests, analysis of the guns themselves, handwriting analysis, the blanket in which the rifle was wrapped, the photographs and the documents linking Oswald to the crime. And Earl Warren was not too dignified to race down the stairs at the depository building, matching his time against Oswald's. In the end, we find confronting each other the liar, the misfit, the defector on the one hand, and 7 distinguished Americans on the other.
I knew Earl Warren very well. I knew him so well that I found it a little difficult to disbelieve him. I couldn't conceive in my mind that a man as honorable as Earl Warren would try to deceive the American people.
I recall an esteemed professor opening it up and showing me. He said, look at all these footnotes. They had over 7,000 footnotes. It was really spiffy. And 7,000 footnotes to fraud.
I believe that Warren was involved. I think that he knew what he was doing. I think he may have been the one member of the Warren Commission other than Allen Dulles who knew. Lyndon Johnson then adopted the Warren Commission's findings. Not only adopted them, but publicly endorsed them. Not only publicly endorsed them one time, publicly endorsed them a dozen times, 24 times. Yet, not long before he died, he was being interviewed by a very distinguished and honorable newspaper reporter named Howard K. Smith. And Howard K. Smith asked him a number of questions and finally came to this question. Well, what about the Kennedy assassination? Lyndon Johnson blurted out, Kennedy tried to kill Castro, but Castro got Kennedy first.
Well, during a long interview I had with Mr. Johnson at the LBJ Ranch in September 1969, we talked about the Kennedy assassination. A portion of the interview was not broadcast at the president's request on the grounds, he said, of national security. I asked Mr. Johnson then whether he was satisfied there was no international conspiracy in his assassination.
I can't honestly say that I've ever been completely relieved of the fact that there might have been international connections.
You mean you still feel that there might have been?
Well, I have not completely discounted.
Well, that would seem to indicate that you don't have full confidence in the Warren Commission report.
No, I think the Warren Commission study, and I think first of all is composed of the ablest, most judicious, bipartisan men in this country. Second, I think they had only one objective, and that was the truth. Third, I think they were competent and did the best they could. But I don't think that they or me or anyone else is always absolutely sure of every thing that might have motivated Oswald or others that could have been involved.
Only a few weeks ago, a Harris poll revealed that 7 out of 10 Americans are convinced that there remain many important unanswered questions, that the whole truth has not been told. A Gallup poll shows more than 6 of every 10 Americans question that there was a lone assassin.
I don't think that all the facts were brought out. I think something was held back.
I think there were more involved in it than just Oswald.
The only thing that disturbs me is the fact that they've sealed away some of the evidence, and I think that's rather disturbing to most people.
I don't know how in the world they could ever reach a conclusion that one person assassinated him. This is ridiculous. I saw the whole thing on television. I just happened to be home at that time. And I don't think that Oswald, I think that he was working for the CIA.
In 1965, a series of books were written criticizing the Warren Commission's conclusion. In 1966, a film was produced by Emile D'Antonio, a Harvard classmate of John F. Kennedy. Entitled Rush to Judgment, it provides an argument for the defense of Lee Harvey Oswald. But it was in 1967 that the Kennedy assassination was back in the headlines, when a New Orleans district attorney named Jim Garrison charged businessman Clay Shaw with the murder.
We know what cities were involved. We know how it was done in the essential respects. We know the key individuals involved, and we're in the process of developing evidence now. I thought I made that clear days ago.
Although the Garrison trial ended in confusion and ridicule, it did result in one thing that made the public sit up and take notice: a bootleg release of the Zapruder film.
Jim Garrison subpoenaed a copy for the New Orleans trial. It was immediately duplicated as soon as it reached his office and went out to the critical community. Then they took Dan Rather's radio narration and put that in as a soundtrack.
The second shot hit President Kennedy, and there was no doubt there. His head went forward with considerable violence. His head went forward with considerable violence. Forward with considerable violence. Forward.
And so this is how it entered the critical community, through this one format. and went to college campuses. And I would guess conservatively hundreds and hundreds of thousands of college students saw it. And when in the anti-war demonstrations, they would show that. And when CBS would appear, they would yell out to them, "Forward at considerable speed," showing that they knew that if they lied about the murder of President Kennedy, they'd lie about the war.
It would take 8 more years for the federal government to get involved in the controversy. When they did, it was in response to a series of explosive newspaper reports.
The text of the Cuban report refers to the inquiries of the Rockefeller Commission and also the Church Committee, and mentions as very significant the information published by columnist Jack Anderson about various plots involving gangster John Roselli. In most cases, the evidence involves schemes to assassinate Prime Minister Castro.
I wrote a series of articles about what I learned from Johnny Roselli, what I had double-checked that Johnny Roselli had told me. Basically, it's the toughest story I ever broke, because I had to get my information from 2 of the tightest organizations in America, the Mafia and the CIA. In time, I was able to get Mafia people to talk to me. In time, I was able to get CIA agents to talk to me, and they confirmed the story. And so I wrote about the CIA recruiting Mafia mobsters to attempt to assassinate Fidel Castro.
Do you think that this new information, not available to the Warren Commission, in itself suggests a need to reopen that part of the investigation of President Kennedy's assassination?
Yes, I do.
A series of investigations were immediately conducted at the highest levels of government into the activities of the CIA. The most famous of these were a series of congressional hearings chaired by Idaho Senator Frank Church.
I got a telephone call from Frank Church, the late senator from Idaho. He was astonished at the stories. He says, "Can you back those stories up?" I said, "My sources are good, but you can do it better than I can because you got subpoena power." And so he used his subpoena power, and with that subpoena power was able to back up the stories.
Good evening. The bad news on assassination plots was reported today by the Senate Intelligence Committee. The committee issued a report which says that officials of the United States government initiated plots to kill 2 foreign leaders, were involved in plots to kill 2 others, were implicated in another, and that the CIA was aware of 2 more murder schemes.
It was learned through Church's committee that well over 20 assassination attempts were made against Fidel Castro, and one was in place on the day that Kennedy died.
Yes, sir.
It involved a high-level Cuban official named Rolando Cubella.
This fellow, Rolando Cubella, who had been in touch with us in earlier days for other reasons, even at the time of the Bay of Pigs, came up with the idea that he wanted to lead a military coup against Castro. And from our point of view, that's great. We were looking for political action. What became called, his cryptonym we gave him was Amlash, and the AM was the digraph in those days. And it was basically to help him work a military coup.
It is likely that at the very moment President Kennedy was shot, a CIA officer was meeting with a Cuban agent in Paris and giving him an assassination device for use against Castro.
I believe it was a hypodermic syringe they'd given him with something called black leaf number 40 in it. This was in response to Amlash's request that he be provided some sort of a device whereby he could kill Castro. He returned this device to the case officer. The case officer brought it back to Washington, and that was the end of the plot.
Okay, but for purposes of discussion, the officer gave this Cuban, this agent in Paris, a device with that material you've described in it. I presume the material, if injected into a human being, would kill him. Is that correct?
I would think so, yes.
So the agent gives the Cuban agent the device to kill somebody.
I'm sorry he didn't give him a pistol, because it would have made the whole thing a lot simpler and less exotic.
Well, whether it's a pistol or a needle, if AMLASH is a political plot to destabilize the government, what in the blazes are we giving an agent a device that will kill Castro with for if it's not an assassination plot?
Well, if you want to have it that way, why don't you just have it that way?
Well, I don't want, it's not a question of what I want.
I think it is what you want, Mr. Dodd.
Mr. Helms, I'm reading to you from reports here, prepared at your request by the Inspector General.
I understand
I'm not
that.
fabricating this or creating out of all my...
I understand that.
I'm quoting.
I understand that.
Well, it's not a question of what I want. It's a question of what this committee would like to know, and the committee is not satisfied, I don't believe at this point, as to exactly what the characterization of AMLASH was.
Well, I've told you what I believe the characterization of AMLASH to be.
Well, how does that jive with this?
If because we gave him a gun or a hypodermic syringe or whatever the case may be at his request because he had aims on Castro, if that is your definition of an assassination plot, then have it that way. That's quite satisfactory with me.
The committee found a certain irony in the fact that a poison pen device was being passed for the purpose of assassinating Castro on the very day that President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas.
Obviously, people had all kinds of crazy ideas, and everybody was worried about it being possibly inspired by the Soviets, possibly inspired by Castro. My own feeling is that Castro may be dumb, but he's not that dumb. I think he knew damn well that if there had been any kind of inkling that could literally prove that he was involved in something like this, I think Cuba would have been wiped off the face of the earth. I mean, it's that simple.
If there was a Cuban involvement in the assassination, it would be much more likely to be anti-Castro Cubans than pro-Castro Cubans. And there is also the possibility of some renegade CIA people being involved.
The Church Committee was never able to link President Kennedy with the assassination attempts on Castro, giving rise to the thought that the CIA may have been working on its own authority. In fact, the Church Committee found clear evidence of a conflicting initiative, that Kennedy was developing plans to normalize relations with Cuba. He was using State Department associate Bill Atwood as an intermediary.
Bill Atwood had been editor of Look magazine. He had, in that capacity, had gone to Cuba in 1959, interviewed Castro. He therefore had an interest in the relationship to the Castro problem.
He asked me what possibilities were there here for an interview in Cuba, and I said, well, that was possible, but I could not guarantee it. That would have to be communicated to my government. Well, in the end, an agenda was going to be drawn for discussion.
Atwood was given authorization by the president to pursue this exploration. He did so. Arrangements were made in the general sense that he might go to Cuba in December of 1963 and talk either to the foreign minister or possibly to Castro himself.
According to what Atwood told me, someone had told Atwood that the president had left a piece of paper on his desk saying that, when I return from Dallas, talk to me about your interview with the Cuban ambassador.
But at any rate, that was the shape of the exploration. I do not think for a moment that the people who endorsed this knew that the CIA was continuing to try to murder Castro.
Well, yeah, that's one track. He was working two tracks. And we always worked two tracks on lots of things. Cuba isn't the only country that I know of where we had two tracks. We had it in Chile in 1970. So two tracks is not unusual, and just because Kennedy was working with one track trying to make some friends with Castro if possible, we were trying to blow the hell out of him with the other hand.
The Church Committee was the first official investigative body to suggest that there may have been a conspiracy involved in the assassination of President Kennedy.
Among the other things, many other things we've been talking about tonight that jump out of this report, just a cursory reading, is the chilling possibility that all of our attempts and discussions about the assassination of Fidel Castro could have in some way triggered the murder of President Kennedy. Did that occur to you too, sir, as you went through all of this?
Of course it occurred to me.
It occurred to all of us. We know that at one point, a few weeks before the assassination of President Kennedy, Mr. Castro himself issued a news release to the effect that if we didn't start leaving him alone, we'd learn that two could play the same game. That doesn't mean that Castro did it. We have no evidence to sustain such a charge, but it's a chilling thought.
Do you plan to examine it in any further detail?
We've gathered all the evidence we can in this field, and as long as the committee is alive, we'll look for more.
Shouldn't somebody be specifically exploring that question, don't you think?
Our committee was never given the authority to reinvestigate the assassination of President Kennedy.
After the Church Committee concluded its investigation into the CIA, a new momentum was building to reopen the investigation of Kennedy's assassination. It was being led by a group of young journalists, including a man named Geraldo Rivera, who broadcast the Zapruder film on television for the first time.
I'm telling you right straight out that if you are at all sensitive, if you're at all queasy, then don't watch this film. Just put on the late night movie because this is very heavy. It's the film shot by the Dallas dress manufacturer Abraham Zapruder, and it's the execution of President Kennedy. And Bob and Dick, would you please narrate what we're seeing as we show this film?
Now this is the Zapruder film.
Okay, so the cars are coming along now into Dealey Plaza?
Yes, these are the lead motorcycles of the motorcade.
All right, now with the President and Mrs. Kennedy is also Governor Connolly.
Right. Now, before he goes behind the sign, the President is waving to the crowd. When he comes out from behind the sign, he is shot, then Governor Connolly is shot.
He's already been hit?
He's already been hit.
And now?
And at the bottom of the screen, the headshot.
That's the shot that blew off his head. It's the most horrifying thing I've ever seen in the movies.
Now, the Warren Commission said that all of the shots were fired from behind by Lee Harvey Oswald, a lone assassin, firing at the President. And as you can see, clearly, the head is thrown violently backwards, completely consistent with the shot from the front, right. Now, this is an extreme blow-up of just the President from the film.
All right.
Coming out behind the sign, he's shot.
He's hit from the
He's hit here.
From the front, too.
From the front. Now, Jackie doesn't realize what's happened yet. She goes to his aid.
And now? He's hit from...
Again, the violent backward motion. Totally consistent with 80% of the witnesses, which said the shot came from the grassy knoll in front and to the right.
It's interesting to note how many people is running towards where most folks thought the shots came from.
That's the most upsetting thing I've ever seen. We'll talk about it in a minute.
The House of Representatives set up a committee to investigate the murders of President Kennedy and Martin Luther King, Jr. It was chaired by Ohio Congressman Louis Stokes.
Never again should our society respond as it did in the aftermath of the deaths of these two great leaders. We did not give these men the type of investigations in depth which were commensurate with the dignity of their lives. We cannot, of course, rewrite history. We cannot bring back President John F. Kennedy or Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. But the past can be a guide for the future. We can and we must promise ourselves that this history will never be again repeated in this nation. And I thank you.
The committee was the first official body since the Warren Commission to investigate the death of President Kennedy. It ran into immediate trouble.
The experience with the House Committee, with the CIA, with the FBI, with so many other government agencies, with the Army, with military intelligence, it has always been that these agencies and these institutions were reluctant helpers in attempting to find out the truth about the Kennedy assassination. Can the government investigate itself adequately? No, I don't believe it can.
A power struggle erupted at the congressional level over the direction of the investigation, and it seemed at first as if the committee would never get properly organized. But then, key potential witnesses started to die, including mafia figures Johnny Roselli, Charles Nicoletti, and Sam Giancana.
And I have no doubt but that Mr. Roselli knew the identities of those persons that Castro enlisted for the purpose of killing the Kennedys. I do want to make very clear, yes, that I have no knowledge of the identity of those persons.
Because you're afraid for your own life and your family's safety, aren't you?
Well, I naturally am quite concerned in that regard.
The most puzzling death of all was the apparent suicide of an Oswald associate, George de Mohrenschildt.
Now, what brought de Mohrenschildt to the attention of the committee was that when Oswald returned from Russia, Oswald supposedly was this lower class guy who was a working stiff, as it were. De Mohrenschildt was a social figure. He was very much involved in Dallas society. And yet de Mohrenschildt's relationship with Oswald seemed to be very close. His ex-son-in-law said if anyone could have been involved in, with Oswald in the assassination of President Kennedy, it was de Mohrenschildt. And so it was intriguing. We were interested when the House committee was formed in questioning de Mohrenschildt. I received a call from a friend in Dallas, of all places, a journalist, who told me he had just gotten the news that de Mohrenschildt had committed suicide. Put a shotgun to his head and pulled the trigger. But when de Mohrenschildt committed suicide and the newspapers picked it up and it got a major play, Congress then decided politically they had to keep the committee alive, and so as a result of de Mohrenschildt's death, the committee continued.
Once the committee set up its operation, it began to investigate a number of CIA personnel in line with the findings of the Church Committee. One of the CIA agents under suspicion was a counterintelligence specialist named William Harvey.
Could you tell this committee who the individuals were involving mafia chieftains or organized crime figures?
As far as I'm aware, on that particular situation, it was William K. Harvey who was in touch with John Roselli, and it was Harvey and Roselli who were attempting to find, if I understood it correctly, some channel from Florida into Havana.
Why was Harvey under investigation? William King Harvey, known throughout intelligence as the American James Bond, was assigned by Deputy Director Richard Bissell and Director of Plans Richard Helms to head an executive action program for the CIA, which was created to develop assassination attempts against foreign leaders. A mysterious man who was rarely photographed, William Harvey was famous for building a tunnel into Soviet territory in Berlin, what became known as Harvey's Hole. He was on a fast track at the CIA, destined for a role at the top of the agency.
He had a great reputation for building a tunnel in Berlin, which produced a lot of information, though there's some suspicion now, based on newly available Soviet documents, that the KGB knew about the tunnel and was using it as a means of sending disinformation to the West. He was a heavy drinker, and he had a reputation of being a bull in a china shop.
Harvey had held many positions over the years that made him suspicious to the committee. Besides his relationship with Roselli, he was one of only 3 people involved in a covert program to send false defectors into the Soviet Union, and was undoubtedly aware of Oswald's defection. As head of the Executive Action Program to assassinate Castro, he developed a profile of the ideal assassin. In his handwritten notes for the program, codenamed ZR Rifle, he defines the ideal assassin as a person with communist credentials that can be used if the cover is blown.
I talked to Harvey, and he told me that he trusted Johnny Roselli, that I could believe Johnny Roselli, after I filled him in on some of the things Roselli had told me. And he confirmed, very reluctantly, it took me not 5 years, but it took me quite a while to get William Harvey to talk to me. When he did talk to me, he confirmed Roselli's story.
Finally, Harvey hated the Kennedys. After the Cuban Missile Crisis, he had a confrontation with Bobby Kennedy that virtually ended his career, exiling him to an intelligence station in Rome.
During the Cuban Missile Crisis, everything was extremely tense, and suddenly it was discovered that Harvey had sent a team of people into Cuba, and the Kennedys were very concerned that this crisis might explode into nuclear war. And Robert Kennedy particularly was in a rage when he heard that this loose cannon had added a further element of unpredictability to the situation.
I mean, we had a terrible experience with the ones that were handling it at the time of the missile crisis. They were going to send 60 people into Cuba right during the missile crisis. Nobody knew what they were doing. They never talked. They explained. I just heard about it because one of the fellows who was going to go wrote me or got in touch with me and said, we don't mind going, but we want to make sure we're going because you think it's worthwhile. And I checked into it. Nobody knew about it. And then the CIA didn't, the top officials didn't, and we pinned it down to the fellow who was supposed to be in charge, and he said we planned it because the military wanted it done, and I asked the military, and they never heard of it.
Oh my God.
This is the same fellow who put the tunnel under Berlin, and so you remember that tunnel in 1948? They constructed a tunnel under and built it up into the intelligence office of which was a hell of a project. But he did that better than he did this. Of course, I was furious because I said you were dealing with people's lives. And the best of the Cubans, and they're the ones that volunteer, and then you're going to go off with a half-ass operation such as this. We had a meeting at the Pentagon on it. I've never seen him since.
Bill Harvey, in the CIA fashion, instead of being retired as he should have been, was sent as station chief in Rome, where I believe he drank himself to death, or at least into retirement.
As the House Committee would learn, Harvey maintained his friendship with Johnny Roselli long after his exile to Rome. It was this connection that was of serious interest to the committee, and they wanted to ask Harvey about it. Unfortunately, Harvey died of a massive heart attack within weeks of his scheduled testimony. The committee investigated Kennedy's assassination for close to 2 years and issued its final report on July 17, 1979. It concluded that neither the Soviets nor the Cubans had anything to do with the assassination, but they still believed a conspiracy was at hand. Quote, "The committee believes, on the basis of the evidence available to it, that President John F. Kennedy was probably assassinated as a result of a conspiracy. The committee is unable to identify the other gunman or the extent of the conspiracy," end quote. Although they refused to name names, the committee suggested for the first time that individual members of the CIA, of the Mafia, and of anti-Castro groups may have been involved in the assassination of President Kennedy. The committee concluded its investigation not because it had exhausted its subject, but because it had run out of funds. It remains the last word on the Kennedy assassination.
The priorities, especially for instance, in the case of the House Select Committee on Assassination, turned out to be getting a report done in time, getting a report done within the financial restrictions that were imposed upon us by Congress. And so there wasn't a totally valid investigation at any level of the House Select Committee on Assassination.
But let me ask you this, aren't you now leaving us in a state of suspension? Because at the very end of your investigation, you really come forth with the most dramatic, the most suggestive evidence that there was some kind of conspiracy. So isn't it logical that you go on, or at least that somebody pursue this?
Well, I think it ought to be pursued, yes. Probably the Justice Department would be the proper department, the FBI itself in terms of the King investigation, and the Justice Department and the Kennedy investigation.
Since the conclusion of the House Committee, all investigations of Kennedy's death have been left to the public, and the public has made a mess of it. In the early 1990s, movie director Oliver Stone lit a fire of controversy with the distribution of his conspiracy movie, JFK.
The reason that I think Oliver Stone's film, JFK, was a necessary film to make is not because I agree totally with Oliver's conclusion, but because it was a great filmmaker making a movie that made people ask questions. And I think questions have to be asked.
Your movie is a vast tissue of falsehood, deception, and distortion. To that end, I challenge you personally, one-on-one, to debate publicly the facts of President Kennedy's assassination. I expect you to decline this invitation because your movie cannot be defended on a factual basis.
I think Oliver's film was a very, very valuable movie because it made them open the files to a degree, and it raised a lot of questions. I mean, you know, I think we're all being very hoodwinked by the Warren Commission. And in my lifetime, we'll never actually know the truth, if the truth is ever to be known. But except in my humble opinion, it was not Lee Harvey Oswald acting alone. And I don't think the Kennedy family thinks it was either.
The reactions to Oliver Stone's movie were quick and often angry, and they were rebutted most forcefully in Case Closed, a best-selling book by investigative reporter Gerald Posner.
I think the answer to this assassination is found in Lee Harvey Oswald's life. There's no question. Because what we've never had in this country, the American public has never had a reason to understand why Oswald ended up on the 6th floor of the depository shooting at Kennedy. What I try to give you is such a psychological and detailed profile of Oswald's life that you as the reader finally understand why he killed Kennedy. And I think you do see it in this book. A man so disturbed over a period of time, psychologically imbalanced, very violent, somebody who tried to kill an American Army general, that by the time November 22nd comes around and he goes up and takes his rifle to that corner window to shoot at Kennedy, you really understand why he's there.
Instead of closing the case, the book has only created more controversy.
I have read Posner's book, and it is beyond question the most blatantly dishonest, intentionally, factually corrupt book ever written in American history, let alone the assassination of President Kennedy. There is no saving grace about it. He lies, cheats, wrongs, and defrauds.
While we will probably never know who killed Kennedy, we may ultimately know why he was killed. We are still engaged in a struggle for information on the assassination. This documentary, for example, is the first forum to present the original Zapruder film, some 35 years after the event. Some answers will come with new information and the release of new documents. But the reasons for the assassination will not be found in the archives or the locked cabinets of government. Instead, the reasons will be ferreted out through a struggle for history as we gain a new perspective on the dynamics of the past. Kennedy was assassinated at the height of the Cold War, a time of intense ideological crisis. Kennedy was making decisions that were affecting the outcome of that war and the institutions of government. Along the way, he was making enemies. To get a handle on the assassination, it may be best to look to Kennedy himself for answers. What was he fighting for? Who was he fighting against? What was he concerned about?
Well, I think there was great concern in the early 1960s about the power of the right. I mean, groups like the Minutemen and the John Birch Society were obviously fringe groups. But Barry Goldwater, for example, wrote a book in 1963 called Why Not Victory, in which he really argued for the release of American power to destroy the Soviet Union. And there was a lot of reaction, of unthinking, rather mindless reaction. Why don't we drop the bomb and all that kind of thing. And this struck a chord through the country, particularly in the Southwest, particularly in Texas, The military was infected to a degree of this. General Walker was an extreme case, but there was more of it. Kennedy encouraged the making of the film 7 Days in May, and he encouraged John Frankenheimer to make a very effective movie of it. Not that he thought that a military putsch was likely, but he wanted to raise the national consciousness about the problems involved if generals got out of control.
7 Days in May was a political thriller in which the Joint Chiefs of Staff plot to overthrow the president and the government.
We got a message from P.S. Ollinger that the president was most anxious to see this movie made, and that the president would do everything he could to make our life easy. In other words, give us access to the White House Secret Service people so that we could interview them and do our research, and shoot outside the White House the riot. And he would go to Hyannisport while we did that. And that's exactly what happened.
You got something against the English language, Colonel?
No, sir.
Then speak it plainly, if you will.
I'm suggesting, Mr. President, there's a military plot to take over the government. This may occur sometime this coming Sunday.
The theme is very clear, that this threat from the far right is never very far from us. And Barry Goldwater, General LeMay, all those people really personified that kind of thing, and we were very opposed to it. And luckily we were able to get a forum to express our political viewpoint as well as a dramatic point of view.
The lead conspirator in 7 Days in May was General Scott, played by Burt Lancaster. To motivate the Joint Chiefs behind his plan, he ridiculed the idea of the president's test ban treaty with the Soviets.
I know you think I'm a weak sister, General. But when it comes to my oath of office, defending the Constitution of the United States...
Nobody has to teach me how to salute a flag.
Somebody has to teach you about the democratic processes that flag represents.
But don't you presume to take on that job, Mr. President. Because frankly, you're not qualified. Your course of action in the past year has bordered on criminal negligence. This treaty with the Russians is a violation of any concept of security. You're not a weak sister, Mr. President. You're a criminally weak sister.
Well, the Joint Chiefs of Staff did not consist, we thought in the White House, of the quality of the generals of the Second World War. Eisenhower, Marshall, Bradley, people like that were men of genuine quality. General Lemnitzer was a nice man, but not a very forceful man. Admiral Burke and General LeMay, representing the Navy and the Air Force, were incredible characters. I mean, they were both very good fighting men, but to have them as members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, they were so intemperate and so unaware of the dangers of nuclear war, or of the sensitivity of the political equilibrium. Kennedy in particular could not stand LeMay. And yet LeMay was a great hero in the Second World War. He had many admirers on the Hill. To get rid of LeMay would pay a heavy political price. So Kennedy would have to endure LeMay. After Lemnitzer retired, he made Maxwell Taylor, who was a much more thoughtful general, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And between McNamara and Max Taylor, even LeMay and Burke were kept relatively under control.
The Kennedy assassination may very well be the defining moment of our time, and yet it has become marginalized and ridiculed as an obsessive concern of conspiracy buffs. Failing everything else, the Kennedy assassination needs to take its rightful place in our history, so that the importance of the event can be properly evaluated and we can better understand how our world and our political system have been altered and changed. Only then will we be able to comprehend what has become a difficult and elusive truth.
People ask today, will we ever find out the truth about the Kennedy assassination? My feeling is that we know the truth about the Kennedy assassination. There is no doubt it was a conspiracy. We perhaps don't know the apparatus, exactly how it was carried out, but we do know there's absolutely no doubt. There's proof. The Warren Commission itself provided us evidence that there was a conspiracy.
It's conceivable that there was a conspiracy. If there was a conspiracy, why has not someone described it? I mean, some participant in the conspiracy. I know you get into the widening circle of all the participants dying, but they must have told someone or left a manuscript for someone to sell at the National Enquirer for $185,000 or something like that. I'm skeptical about the conspiracy, but I don't know.
I think most Americans are just too wrapped up in themselves to want to become involved in the Kennedy assassination anymore. It's history. And it makes you wonder whether that's not the way it eventually was supposed to turn out.
Never have the nations of the world had so much to lose or so much to gain. Together we shall save our planet, or together we shall perish in its flames. Save it we can, and save it we must. And then shall we earn the eternal thanks of mankind, and as peacemakers, the eternal blessing of God.
Raymond, if we were at war, and you were suddenly to become infatuated with the daughter of a Russian agent, wouldn't you expect me to come to you and object, and beg you to stop the entire thing before it was too late? Well, we are at war. It's a cold war, but it will get worse and worse until every man, woman, and child in this country will have to stand up and be counted.
Perhaps you have heard that anti-communist programs and activities are creating an unhealthy, divisive, and dangerous climate of suspicion in America. Perhaps you have heard that such programs have the effect of making Americans distrustful of their neighbors. Some would even have us believe this air of suspicion is psychopathic, that all anti-communists are really mentally ill.
Wonder if you'd mind giving us your opinion of the John Birch Society?
Are you a member?
That's what I was going to ask you, whether you are, and if you
Are
are
you?
not, what your opinion was.
Are you a member?
I'm not sure that that's significant at this point.
I'm not sure that your question's significant.
No, I'm not a member, sir.
I am a member.
General, we have Robert Welch said...
And I will add to that for your information that if I wasn't a member today, I would be considering being one very seriously in opposition to anti-communism.
First, I shall check this banana with the Geiger counter to make sure that it has no contamination on it. Next, I shall deliberately contaminate the banana with this radioactive solution. This is not dangerous, but it is mildly radioactive. And when I again check it with the Geiger counter, you can tell by the clicks that it is radioactive. Now watch. I shall carefully peel the banana, check it again for contamination, find that it is safe, and eat it.